Former camera shop owner. Well, you can get ready, Bonnie.
Okay.
Retired middle school language arts teacher, and by husband David Etlin's description, an all-around Renaissance woman. Her photographic awards include a top prize in Kodak's International Kinza Contests, honorable mentions in online juried exhibitions of Women in Photography International. And recently, at age 66, having a photo selected for the permanent collection of the Kinsey Institute. Yes, that Kinsey. She celebrated turning 60 by earning a doctorate in communications design from the University of Baltimore. She's written articles for photography magazines, a weekly column on photography for 6 years in the Baltimore Evening Sun, creates a daily haiku and related photo for one of her current photo word projects, Dog Tag Poetry, which is amazing. And if you Facebook friend Bonnie, you can enjoy those every day. And she occasionally lets off steam in her blog, Journeys. If you know of anyone living in a relationship for at least 40 years, contact Bonnie to learn about her newest project, Together 40 Plus. Bonnie has 2 grown daughters and lives in Pasadena. Please welcome Bonnie. Oh, wait. John, you're doing it.
John's coming.
Oh, okay. I didn't know you were that much taller.
I was standing on my tippy toes.
Right about there.
Okay.
Yes. This hat has nothing to do with my readings, but when we picked up our friend Shirley to come here, she said, I have the first half of your birthday present. My birthday is December 10th, but here it is. Okay. I have two things to read. The first is called Schupp World, Steps, Alphabets, Bones, and Bullies. And the second one is called Flying in the Classroom. I grew up in a stoop world, 4 square blocks of Baltimore City row houses, bordered on the south by a steep railroad bank, on the east by the Girls Catholic High School, which my best neighborhood girlfriend attended, and on the west by Clifton Park with its clay tennis courts, and on the north by a cemetery which would later be dug up, moved, and replaced by a 2 guys parking lot. 22 houses line the block, a visual rhythm of gray wooden porches, each with 5 steps. It was a safe world, where on summer nights, under a hovering blanket of humidity, neighborhood adults lingered and gossiped on their front porches. This was a time before air conditioners and Willie Cole. During those infinite summer days and nights of childhood, we played Mother May I, hide and seek, and bounced the rubber ball against the steps. And we made important decisions about whether to choose a cherry, grape, or banana popsicle from the Good Humor Man. As it grew dark, we ran about reaching and leaping for lightning bugs, which we added to glass jars, metal lids with holes punched so the fireflies wouldn't die. Often we held the glowing jars up to examine the creatures that magically lit up our summer nights with wonder. There were frequent counts to determine who had the most, except for the occasional cruel boy, always a boy, who would delight in pulling off the insect's wings at the end of the night. When mothers called bedtime, we unscrewed the lids, released the lightning bugs. We climbed those 5 stoop steps to the sweltering 2nd floor bedroom and slept in our underwear to the drone of the window fan. Those 5 steps connected the safety of inside and the security of community outside. There were clearly defined rules of behavior and geographical boundaries, and everyone in the neighborhood made certain everyone's children respected these rules. Fuzzy boundaries were rare. We all knew our place. We always addressed adults, except for my grandmother's black maid, by Miss, Mrs., or Mr., and we dutifully said, yes, ma'am, and no, sir. My mother always served supper at 5 p.m. after my father rode the streetcar home from work. We were wrapped in certainties, yet I was always pulled toward uncertainty, testing the limits and asking what if. As a child, I discovered those 5 stoop steps were not merely for climbing or sitting. They provided an opportunity to poke at the shroud of safety. We would jump off the steps on the concrete pavement, graduating to higher steps as we grew bolder. The bottom step was the baby one for those just learning how to balance and move their bodies. Success jumping from the second step emboldened us to move upward. When the third step loomed, we realized things were becoming more serious. Uncertainties crept into our play, as well as skinned knees that grew scabs, which our mothers told us not to pick. How many times did I look down at the concrete from the fourth step and then quietly move back to the third, safer step? Eventually, the fourth step lured me. I crouched, pulled both arms back, and swung them out with determination, held my breath for the flight from step 4 to the unrelenting pavement, and landed on 2 feet with a skip or two. What a feeling of power. How long would it be before I'd have the courage to jump from the porch? Ah, the thrill of uncertainty. Later in my 20s, I continued to dream of literal heights, much greater than the porch stoop. And what if I jumped out of an airplane? I would find that out when I turned 30. In those days, time stretched out like gooey taffy strings that extended forever. But the summer I was 6, I learned there were deeper layers in my world that I'd felt so simple. One sultry summer night, the entire neighborhood sat outside on their stoops, complaining almost in unison about the heat. I was a few houses up the street playing with one of my friends, and at some point I realized that the orchestrated murmur of the neighborhood gossip had suddenly stopped. I heard instead sharp cries and screams. Still, to my 6-year-old mind, grown-ups were prone to irrational behavior. I continued with my play. Then I began to hear, Bonnie, Ronnie, Bonnie, Ronnie. Isolated words. I continued to play until I heard my parents, with a no-nonsense tone, shout for me. This was a run, don't walk call. When I reached my home, my mother grabbed me screaming, "Why didn't you come when I called you?" I didn't know what I'd done. I did come, I told her. I did come. She continued to hold me and said angrily, "I want you to come the first time I call you." Then she began to cry, uncontrollably, and go limp. As my father helped her to their bedroom, he instructed my sister and me not to leave our front porch. I still did not understand. From our porch, my sister and I noticed a commotion on the street in front of us. A crowd of adults stood around in the middle of the street, some kneeling down, then there were flashing lights and a siren. Our next-door neighbor explained to us that my mother was upset because the boy across the street, my age, had been hit by a car. He and his friends were playing tag and darting in and out of parked cars when a car driving down the street in the approaching dusk had hit him. I watched as an ambulance in Baltimore took this boy away to the hospital. My mother had heard my name, Bonnie, as the accident victim. The boy's name was Ronnie. My life had been just one alphabet letter away from being changed in an instant. At that moment, I began to realize that my safe world might not be so safe after all. Of course, childhood lessons don't stick very long. Ronnie eventually came home from the hospital with his head bandaged. He didn't seem to act quite the same as he used to anymore, but then he was a boy, and I didn't play with boys when I was 6. I continued in my sheltered world. My sister Nancy was 2 years younger, and I was expected to look after her. We played together and shared friends. Without fancy toys, we played in our own imaginary world. We picked weeds growing from the sidewalks and made peas for pretend meals. We disseminated anthills, also abundant in the cracks, and poured gravy over the peas. We knew enough not to eat this, but we pretended to enjoy our home-cooked meals. However, the unknown lured me, even things that pulled me out of my comfort zone. And one day, my mother discovered us 3 blocks from home, looking for the bones that another child told me were sticking out of the old grave at the cemetery. I got a spanking on the spot. Later, I heard adults speaking in mysterious tones about a little girl's body that had been found in the cemetery soon after that. She had been raped and strangled. My safe world was beginning to develop new layers. That 6th summer, I had just learned to ride a 2-wheeled bicycle. My father had gotten hold of an old boy's bike, but my legs weren't long enough to reach the pedals. He tied wooden blocks onto the pedals so I could reach them. No training wheels for me. Getting onto the bike was difficult because I had to lean the bike against the fence, climb onto the wooden blocks, and push off. I loved this new freedom, even though I could only ride in the alley behind our house because my mother thought the street was too dangerous. She didn't know there was a different type of danger in the back alley. I rode up and down for hours until one time, 3/4 of the way down the alley, a large girl shouted out that she would not let me ride past her yard. She stood in the middle with feet planted far apart, arms outstretched. "Nah, nah, 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 you can't go past me." I didn't have any choice but to steer toward a fence, carefully get off, and say, "Yes, I can." "No, you can't," she replied, and didn't budge. I walked my bike back to my house, complained to my mother, who was in the kitchen shelling peas and making crab cakes, purchased from the Arab and his horse-drawn wagon that had come down our alley earlier that morning. I told her what had happened, and she said I had every right to the alley. I should get back on my bike, tell the girl that she couldn't do that, and to please move. Same scene played out again. I walked my bike back home. "Please go down there and make her let me go by," I begged my mother. "No," she said. What? The same mother who wanted to protect me from cars and cemeteries would not protect me from this bully. "You get back on your bike. Tell her to move or you'll run her over." Well, the mother who was so upset when a car ran over another child was now telling me to run over someone on my bike? In my child's mind, it just didn't register. However, I thought it might be worth a try. So I leaned my bike against the fence, climbed on, reached my feet down to the wooden blocks on the pedals, and carefully pushed off. Just as I'd feared, the bully was positioned and blocking my way. I told her in a hesitant voice, "Move, or I'll run you over." "You dare," she said. Well, these words did it for me. I took a deep breath and actually pedaled harder. In my heart, I desperately hoped she'd see me barreling down on her and jump out of the way at the last minute. But she didn't, and I ran into her. She fell with a few new tread marks tattooed on her arm. I fell and gained a number of scrapes. She ran into her house crying to her mother. I got back up on my bike, finished to the end, turned around, came back up the alley with no one blocking the way. I had freed the alley from tyranny. The summer I was 6 was when I began to redefine my world. Now this next section is a little bit later in my life, from my 6-year-old life to my more than 30-year-old life. This is called Flying in the Classroom. This is in present tense. I sort of switched tense here. I sense a sea of hormones about to flood my classroom as the decimal level triples. My second period 8th grade students are approaching. 3 quiet girls and 27 boys who could care less about my language arts class. I stand by the door as they pass by me, no greeting for someone they would be working with for the next 50 minutes. And of course, the word work here is used loosely. I feel a middle school turbulence pelting the air. Something tells me that this class period is going to be more challenging than usual. The grammar drill is on the overhead projector. They're supposed to sit quietly in their assigned seats and begin work. And when the 3-minute bell rings, a signal for class to begin, most are not in their seats. I hear snatches of conversation. Hey, get out of my seat. Who took my pencil? That's gay. She told me. Did you see her? Well, being the professional educator that I am, I calmly remind the students to please sit down and start work. I might have been a fly on the wall, no response. Again, in my professional educator's voice, I remind them 3 more times that class has begun. This time I move about the room, speaking to each student by name. A familiar feeling stirs as I remember my very first 4 weeks of teaching, this time in Baltimore City, years before. Those were the days that I would collapse on my sofa as soon as I arrived home, wanting the love of someone and expecting a little affection from my kitten. Instead, she reached out to swipe me with unretracted claws. Even my kitten was against me. Those days, I cried every day for a month until the survivor instinct began to grow in me. This day, I reminded myself, I am a survivor. And there's no way I can survive 50 minutes of anarchy. Sometimes professionalism does not work. I know from experience that yelling doesn't work. Besides, they would not have heard me anyway. I consider moving some clothing as menopausal symptoms keep flickering on and off, but quickly reject that idea. I am not crazy. I'm actually calm and try to determine the survival techniques I will need to use this day, this hour, this minute. Then it comes to me. I know I'm not crazy, but my students don't. I shift to my alternate stage presence, quietly pick up the red aluminum stool I sometimes sit on, and throw it hard across the front of the room. It hits the wall. Sudden silence. I cannot step out of my new character at this point. I am in the spotlight and need to continue this scene I've started. Now that I can be heard, I whisper to the class. I told you I wanted you to be quiet and begin work. As I looked around the room, making eye contact with the worst offenders, I added, still whispering, and I mean it. I wear a face that reads, this teacher might really be crazy. My students, now in their seats, open their notebooks, find something to write with, and begin to work. They glance occasionally at the red. Oh, I am so glad it is red paint on the floor, which had chipped off the stool. This red paint had hit the wall and was laying on the floor. I leave the stool to the floor, a foot from the nearest student, one of the rowdiest. Then I begin to walk up and down the rows of seats, commenting to each student about the work. By the time I reach the 3rd row, one of the boys looks at me and asks tentatively, Miss Schupp, are you okay? Well, not stepping out of my crazy teacher demeanor, I roll my eyes. Eric, I'm not really sure. I congratulate myself for this touch of genius. Eventually, and ever so calmly, I pick up the stool and return it to its place. The rest of the class period turns out to be productive. When the bell rings, just like the whack-a-mole game, the students pop up out of their seats, eager to run out. My determined voice puts them back in their seats. Oh, no, you don't. Sit down. Then I proceeded to dismiss each student one at a time. The next few hours create some uncertainties in my mind. Will there be repercussions from my unprofessional but survivor behavior? The office is just 2 doors down the hall from my classroom, yet no administrator comes in to remove a crazed teacher from her classroom. The suspense is killing me. I wait another hour until I see the vice principal monitoring the hall traffic between classes. I approached her. If you heard any rumors about my second period class, I want to tell you now they're all true. She smiles. We heard about the stool before it hit the floor. Students had rushed into the office to report their teacher, but this time my good reputation pays off. Not long after that, the guidance counselor tells me that a student from that class, a notoriously disruptive student, who had been closest to the fallen stool, told her I had thrown a stool at him. She responded, "Ben, if Miss Schupp had thrown a stool at you, she would have hit you." End of story? No. Change of scene. 1 or 2 years later, I'm home and my daughter is waiting for a new date. He comes to the door, steps inside, looks at me and says, "I never had another teacher throw a stool in class." My daughter leaves for her first date with Eric, and I'll have to admit wishing it might be her last with him, too. It was. End of story? No. Change of scene. 15 years later, and now the era of Facebook. I receive a Facebook message. "Hi, Miss Schupp. I was in your class in the 90s, and I was a son of a bitch. I hope you'll forgive me and be my Facebook friend, Ben." I write back and mention that it had certainly taken him a long time to apologize, but of course, I will be his Facebook friend. End of story? Who knows?